Don, you're a cognitive scientist,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And we've been struggling all these years with two big questions. One is, of course, what's the universe made of? And I think Joel Primack fairly summarized it. Most of it is invisible. We're trying to figure it out.
The double dark.
The double dark. And the one that's visible is atoms, which we are told are waves, which are also invisible. So the shortest answer is it's made of nothing, right?
Nothing that we know of.
Nothing that we know of. And then the second big question in science is what's the biological basis of consciousness?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if both those questions are wrong, since the universe is not made of anything, and maybe there's no biological basis for consciousness. Maybe biology is an expression of consciousness.
That's the view of it. Can people hear me? Is this on?
Can you hear me?
No. So I'm not turned on.
No, it's not from there. It's from there.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear him?
No?
Let's get a microphone that works, please. Can we turn? Yeah. So I said, what's the biological basis of consciousness? You're a cognitive scientist.
Right.
Tell us what your work is about.
So will I be able to use slides?
Just
for
use.
that? Okay, okay.
Yeah, just use this.
Well, so the standard view in my field, of course, is that the brain causes consciousness. That's the standard view. But I've been doing simulations of evolution. So the standard view is that evolution entails that our perceptions are correct and that the physical world that we see is in fact pretty close to the way objective reality is. But I've been doing simulations to actually study evolution because it's a mathematical theory. We don't have to guess what it entails about perception. And my studies I pit animals in hundreds of thousands of worlds, some animals that see the truth, some that don't see the truth but are tuned to fitness. And what I find is that animals that see the truth go extinct. They go extinct very quickly. And so the idea that's come out of that is that our perceptions of space and time and physical objects are not an insight into the nature of reality. Instead, we have evolved a species-specific set of symbols. a user interface, so to speak, like the interface on a desktop. Oh, man.
That's all right.
Yeah, just a little sip. That should help. So what this entails is that our assumption that space and time are fundamental aspects of objective reality is almost surely false. And our assumption that physical objects in space and time are part of objective reality that are observer independent is also almost surely false. And that also then our notion that physical objects have causal powers independent of observers is also probably false. And so this falls out of the evolutionary game simulations, and the implication of this now for your question, is there a biological basis to consciousness, is that there can only be a biological basis to consciousness if neurons can in fact have causal powers. But if neurons, being physical objects, have no causal powers, then they don't cause anything, and in particular they don't cause consciousness. So I've been forced, sort of surprising, by my study of evolution and evolutionary games and genetic algorithms to the conclusion that neural activity cannot give rise to conscious experiences. And so then I'm exploring, consciousness clearly exists and we do see a physical world, so if we can't get consciousness from the physical world, can we go the other direction? And that's what I'm exploring, is a mathematical model of consciousness.
Neil, any comments? You might as well come here and speak. We're trying to pack in a lot in a very short time, so this is just a glimpse of Don Hoffman's work, which he has presented at many conferences, including Stuart Hameroff's conference towards the science of consciousness, and he engaged in a very lively debate with Daniel Dennett whose final conclusion was, "I'll have to study your work," was how he concluded. What do you have to say about?
We should forgo slides then?
I think so.
Okay. I'm also coming at things from a direction I wasn't really expecting to get to where I wound up. For me, I'm a physician and I'm a cell biologist, and I was interested in how cells self-organize into the emergent property of our bodies, and those self-organize into larger scale structures. And one of the things that caught my attention, full disclaimer, I'm also a Zen Buddhist student, is that if you see a flock of birds, it looks like a thing. But if you go up close, you realize it's not a thing, it's just a bunch of birds. In the same way, as a pathologist, I look at tissues under the microscope all the time, and I see that the body itself is merely a colony of cells or a flock of cells, most of which aren't human. And so the idea of something being a thing with a boundary suddenly becomes fluid. And this relates, I think, to the Buddhist idea of emptiness of inherent existence. You are all individuals, and so are we, to quote Monty Python. But at the same time, we're a community that is a thing. And at the same time, we're not things at all. We're merely human and bacterial cells and a few viruses and fungi in this sort of soup here. If you go down lower level of scale to the molecular and atomic level, there's no atom in your body that you didn't drink, eat, or breathe from the planet. We are nothing but the emergent phenomena of the planet organizing itself into beings that think they're separate from each other. So the farther you go down in scale, the more the boundary extends outward. The idea of boundedness itself is scale dependent. So what happens if you go down to below the atomic level? Now you're in the quantum realm, and we know that non-locality pertains. And so and then you go all the way down to the Planck level, you can't get smaller than that, and whatever those smallest things are, strings or something else, they're popping in and out of the energetic vacuum. So the entire universe is a self-organizing system, no state of which is actually a thing. It looks like a thing or not, depending on how you observe it. And so we start to get into quantum physics and the importance of the conscious observer to determine the nature of the universe. But not only in the quantum realm, but do I interact with you as an audience, or do I act with you as individuals? Do you want to ask me something now? And suddenly the dynamic of the room changes. That's not the same as quantum weirdness, but it is quantum-like, and that spans the universe at all levels of scale. So Menas and I have been exploring this and thinking, well, what if we start with the idea that consciousness is that out of which the universe arises? And then you wind up having that the first level of emanation is space, time, mass, and energy out of consciousness. That's a complementary pairing. And the way, wave-particle dualities, or those two faces that look together at each other, and you see the vase or you see the two faces. You can't see both at the same time. Those interact and create, through emergence, as was mentioned, the next level of scale. Those are complementary, those two levels of scale. Those interact into higher levels, and that's how the universe self-organizes. It's just as scientifically valid to start with the hypothesis that consciousness is the substrate out of which the universe self-organizes into this kind of structure.
While Menas is saying, I think it's only fair that Stuart should comment also. So would you mind to come up? I want to ask you specifically about Planck scale, space-time geometry, and Platonic truth and your work with Penrose.
So I will just add a couple of things that Neil was just saying. And the work that Don, for example, is doing, and the work that we're doing, now we're getting down to the mathematics, to the actual, if you like, proto-mathematics, elementary mathematics, which can give us the relationships between the object and subject. So what I was going to talk about is those relationships between the object and the subject. And it's actually very, very interesting, because before we heard about the various interpretations of quantum theory. Where is the cut? Where is the Heisenberg's cut? Where is the von Neumann cut? And what the speakers were kept sort of indicating is that it is sort of arbitrary. And in fact, if you follow that, if you continue along this line of thinking, and here I think we're talking about the frameworks of consciousness rather than the theory of consciousness, if you're talking about frameworks of consciousness, then what is actually very, very interesting that comes out of this whole thing is that there is an encompassing view that the underlying reality is non-dual conscious reality, which drives the evolution, emergence comes out of it, et cetera, and actually ties to quantum brain and to whatever's going on in the brain.
Stuart.
Thank you. The cut itself is consciousness. So we heard about the Copenhagen interpretation where you have an observer observing a superposition causing collapse. That's von Neumann, Wigner, Stapp, Copenhagen. That puts consciousness outside science, which is why Stan Klein is proud to be a dualist, because he puts consciousness outside science. However, it still doesn't answer why collapse occurs, why consciousness causes collapse. The Penrose interpretation, I was a little surprised that it wasn't included in the survey of interpretation of quantum mechanics, says consciousness is collapse. It's a spontaneous, when you have a superposition, that's actually a separation in space-time geometry, much like the multiple worlds hypothesis. But instead of each possibility branching off to form a new universe, the separation in the universe is unstable, and after time t will collapse to one or the other, and that's a moment of consciousness. And that happens like every 25 milliseconds in our brain, and we have 40 conscious moments per second, or maybe many, many more. The point is, collapse itself is conscious, is a moment of consciousness, and it occurs in everything, but when it's orchestrated and organized in our brains, we get full, rich consciousness.
Well, as you can see, not everyone totally agrees here with each other. I don't think Don agrees with much of what you said, and I don't think
Although
you
I would
agree.
say that Don's interface is collapse in the brain, spontaneous self-collapse.
You know, I've been listening to you guys for some time, so I put together a couple of slides, and I want to show them. I think they might, in some way, be a compromise to all your points of view. So can I have the slides of the top-down approach, please? Can we have the top-down approach Prezi, please? The Prezi. Mind you, these are theories. Nobody really knows, as I said, what the heck is going on. Huh?
Deepak, can I say one thing? That
yeah.
the Penrose interpretation is the only testable hypothesis. Multiple worlds isn't testable. The observer isn't testable. GRW is testable and proven wrong. So of the viable theories, Penrose objective reduction is the only one that's even testable, and it's being tested at UC Santa Barbara in some very sophisticated experiments, and they say now that within 7 years they'll be able to test it. Now that won't prove that it causes consciousness, because, but it will show that collapse occurs when Penrose predicted it will.
Okay, so you know, here's a slide I put together, and I'm not going to show all of it, but it's based on some of the comments that you gentlemen have made over the years that I've been listening to. I just want to move it forward, and this clicker is not helping me. Okay, here we go. Okay, those are the emergent property of this consciousness, by the way. Those are the emergent properties of Deepak's consciousness, my grandchildren. Here are the two open questions, according to Science magazine. What is the universe made of? What is the biological basis of consciousness? So this was of the 125 open questions in Science magazine, and hasn't changed since then, what we don't know. So the number one is, here's the essence of the hard problem. There's no scientific explanation for mental or perceptual experience. How atoms and molecules build up to a brain-producing consciousness. And therefore, the question that all these gentlemen are raising is, can we look at a top-down approach, looking at consciousness as a non-local possibility field that essentially expresses itself as what you call qualia gestalts, And you say that protoqualia might be embedded in space-time geometry.
Fundamental property of the universe, just like mass, spin, charge are ingrained in the fine scales, in the cosmological concept.
That they're embedded in Planck scale space-time geometry.
Yes.
You know, I heard David Chalmers' talk at TED, and he kind of was suggesting that too, as a fundamental property of the universe, as like gravity or
He's coming over to the quantum side now, Chalmers.
slowly. Okay, so here's basically, I'm going to skip all these because there's a lot of, you know, it has implications in a lot of areas, including biological well-being, and these studies are going to be summarized tomorrow in our presentation on self-directed biological transformation. But what I would like to share with you, and I'm skipping all the studies because we'll be talking about them tomorrow, and you perhaps recognize this slide from Eric Schott and all the things that meditation does to gene expression. But this is basically, and I'd like each of you to comment on these points if you could. Okay, so consciousness is holistic, acausal, non-local. It has sentience, the property of sentience. It's self-knowing, self-organizing, self-regulating, recursive with feedback loops, a word that you use all the time in your writings. And this is from Neil and Menas. Correlative, because here we have, as Eric Schott spoke, networks of feedback loops, and now we are learning non-local correlations, and the emerging era of quantum biology and quantum universe, and complementarity at all levels. So wave-particle complementarities is one way of looking at it, but why not mind and matter, organism and environment, gene, epigene, and evolutionary expressions leading to emergence through creativity. Some of those points you heard through Nancy Abrams as well. So would you take a crack at any of these points?
Okay, the idea that consciousness is holistic, acausal, and non-local, if space and time are not fundamental, and that's what the evolutionary simulations seem to suggest to me, that space-time and physical objects are a species-specific way to live long enough to have kids and nothing deeper, then consciousness is not, in fact, trapped in space and time, and so in that sense it is non-local. Yeah, in space and time in some sense exist as symbols within consciousness, but consciousness itself is not trapped in space and time, so absolutely. And then I have a mathematical model of consciousness that I'm developing in which you can actually show how conscious, what I call conscious agents, can in fact be sentient and self-knowing, self-organizing and self-regulating, and recursive with feedback loops. In fact, you can show that these networks of conscious agents have the computing power of a universal Turing machine, at least, so that anything that can be computed in a standard computational model, say in cognitive neuroscience, can also be done if you assume consciousness is fundamental. So there's no loss of computational power by assuming consciousness is fundamental as opposed to a physical world. I should pass it off and let someone else take a shot.
So in terms of the sentience, it's almost, of course, a tautology because sentience means consciousness. But I think what you're driving at, Deepak, is that sentience is at an even more fundamental level, perhaps going down to the level of space-time itself or even beyond it. In terms of the complementarity, the main point that actually I want to make here is that we usually talk about following Einstein's beautiful ways of putting some things, spooky actions at the distance. My big problem is that if this is correct, and this is, of course, we need to be developing this more and more. If this is correct, then the question is not the spooky actions of the distance of the quantum world, but the spooky actions of the mind, or this spooky mind that gives the appearance of separateness, even though the underlying reality is wholeness. So I call the spooky mind as a big mystery, and not the non-local.
So, recently both Max Tegmark and Kak, Christoph Kak, have made pretty big headlines. Christoph Kak with his wonderful book where he talks about Confessions of a Reductionist, a romantic reductionist, he says, and he talks about Tononi's theories of integrated information. But he's come out of at least the box that he was talking about. Consciousness is a product of the brain. He's now out of the brain, it seems to me, reading his book on Tononi's hypothesis of integrated information. The other one is Max Tegmark, who's made a lot of headlines recently saying that consciousness is organized matter. And so I did write to him. I said, would you be willing to switch it, flip it? Matter is organized consciousness. And so, we have an ongoing conversation, but at least the conversation is happening at the moment. Neil, would you like to comment?
Yeah,
You're a panpsychist, right?
Yes.
So I've heard you say you're a panpsychist.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a lousy word, but yeah, okay, I'm a panpsychist. But I think one of the things that we have to think about is that the emergentist theories of where consciousness comes from, whether it's coming from a human brain or from any kind of brain or any kind of nervous system or something alive, or even consciousness is a property of subatomic particles, all of those don't allow us to consider data as testable or even studyable, such as altered mind states from contemplative practice, psi phenomena like precognition or viewing at a distance. There's a whole range of topics that there's a good amount of data out there that these are real phenomena that can be studied and quantified, but it's not allowed within the discourse because emergentist theories don't allow for them. And so it's excluded. And I think that any set of theories that say, oh, I'm not accepting that as data that's appropriate for study, already tells me there's a problem. I don't know whether you're right or we're right or you're right. I don't even know that we're actually contradictory. It may be that we're talking about mechanisms of how these things play out within each other's context. I also know that complementarity tells you that no possible conception we have will contain the entire thing. Gödel's theorem, for those people who know it, is that's what it's talking about. So in fact, none of our theories can possibly explain everything. We need different theories to capture it from different perspectives. What Menas and I are trying to do is to show that the substrate underneath all that is non-dual, where we don't talk about drawing boundaries. We don't talk about, it's not either or, it's both and you just sort of have to accept that. And it's not an accident that that's perceiving the world that way is a goal of a lot of contemplative practices, because our minds are expressing that larger mind.
I see at this moment there are three competing worldviews. One which is dualism, which seems to be actually not tenable. It violates all kinds of laws, including thermodynamics. So we're left with two. It's all a material, non-dual entity, the whole universe, or it's a non-material, non-dual entity, whatever that is.
It's the transition between the non-material and the material. The problem with panpsychism, consciousness being a property of matter, like Tegmark says, is that matter is, and Koch, is that matter is constantly coming into being from a quantum possibilities. So the atoms in this floor are in superposition, they collapse, the superposition collapse, constantly going in and out of being material. So there's no matter there all the time for consciousness to be a property of. It's much simpler to say that the process of collapse from the possibilities to the definite is consciousness. It's a moment of a proto-consciousness. If it's simple, if it gets orchestrated, it's full consciousness. But it's every collapse has a moment of at least proto-consciousness. When you organize it in the brain with the microtubules or whatever, you get full consciousness. Now, I would disagree with one thing. I think consciousness is causal, because every collapse choose.
Oh, I mean acausal in origin.
Okay, good enough.
Sorry.
But I agree with Neil that it's not emergent. Or I think you were saying that. I think neither consciousness nor God are emergent. I think they're both fundamental, built into the universe in the fine scale structure of Planck scale geometry. The same place where apparently there must be something that encodes for spin, mass, charge, the 20 or so constants that give rise to the anthropic principle problem. So everything is embedded there. And I think if I were to have to answer the question where God is, I'd say in rules and laws and vibrations and resonances built into the universe at the Planck scale.
Okay, Don, anything final words? You may say that the human species evolution was not defined or doesn't have the mechanism for truth, that it's actually, if we seek truth as an evolutionary, on the basis of evolution, we become extinct. Can you clarify that?
Right, so we as a species have gone through a very interesting intellectual history over the last few centuries. Actually a couple of millennia, we used to believe the earth was flat because it looks that way. And Aristotle and others began to realize that that's probably not the case and got some evidence, and we got past that. And then a few centuries ago, we still believed the earth is the center of the universe and everything goes around us because it looks that way. And some people had to be burned at the stake, and Galileo was offered torture instruments.
Well, now they get fired.
Yeah, now you just get fired. But back then it was, you actually got burned at the stake. And the reason it was such a compelling belief at the time was because our perceptual systems are telling us the earth isn't moving, everything's moving around us. And now I'm saying those are mere warm-ups. The real challenge for our species is to realize that our perceptions are misleading us, not just about flat earth, not just about earth being the center of the universe, but that the universe itself is spatial and temporal, and that physical objects exist independent of us. That's also the way the world is presented to us by our senses, and it's just as false as flat earth. But getting past that is going to be a big intellectual hurdle, and when we get past it, it will completely transform how we think about the mind-body problem. It will make the idea that the brain causes consciousness just as obviously wrong as flat earth.
Thank you.